Hi guys, it's been a while. Hope you're all keeping well. I've had quite a few people asking about the autofocus settings I use for capturing fast action, and so I thought I'd do a quick video to go over these settings that I use on my A1 Mark II and on the A9 Mark III. People appear to encounter problems in a few main situations. When using pre-capture on fast subjects like small birds that are launching and flying directly towards the camera, when the subject is partially obscured by grass, twigs, large obstacles or other subjects, or when the camera and subject are both very close to the ground or water level. There are obviously many factors that can contribute to these problems, but in this video I will show you some examples of situations where I have used the A1 II without encountering any difficulties. I found that the A1 II behaves very similar to the A9 III, with the exception of course that the 30 frames per second for small birds is not ideal. It seems to coincide with the frequency these birds beat their wings, which results in most images having the same wing positions. Let's take a quick look at the A1 II autofocus settings I was using. These are the default settings that come with the camera. Usually I don't change any settings on a new camera until I find a reason to do so, and as you'll see from the images I've captured, there doesn't seem to be much reason to change these settings for the scenarios shown in the video. The focus mode I use is wide with bird subject detection. In these scenarios it is usually difficult to keep the bird in a smaller focus area, and wide allows the camera to find the subject anywhere in the frame. It's often not possible to react fast enough to keep the subject centered in the frame as they move, so one has to rely on the camera's ability to follow the subject as it moves across the frame. There are three main settings that may affect the autofocus performance with fast subjects. Priority set in AFC, which can be set to AF, release or balanced emphasis. The AF setting means that the camera will only capture an image if it is acquired focus, bearing in mind that this could be focus on the intended subject or focus on the background. The release setting will capture images regardless of whether the camera has acquired focus. And with balanced emphasis setting, the camera will decide on whether to capture an image if it does not have a focus lock. Note that when the camera has pre-capture enabled, the AF option is not available, so be sure to turn off pre-capture if you want to select AF setting. When pre-capture is enabled, the camera will use balanced emphasis, and when pre-capture is disabled, the camera will return to using the AF priority setting. AF level for crossing. This setting will determine whether the camera will tend to stay locked on to the current subject or whether it will tend to change focus to a subject crossing in front of the in-focus subject. The locked on setting will cause the camera to stay focused at the same distance when the subject is momentarily obscured or moves out of the frame. The responsive setting will cause the camera to tend to jump to the object crossing in the foreground. Usually, for wildlife, you want the camera to stay tracking the acquired subject, so a setting of 1, 2 or 3 is most often going to be used. AF tracking for speed change. This setting can be used to change the camera's responsiveness if the subject's speed changes suddenly. For wildlife, one would usually want the camera to be responsive to sudden changes in the subject's speed. For example, to capture images of a bird launching towards the camera. Having said all this, the images that follow were all taken with the default settings as shown, so I haven't seen any reason to make any changes to these settings yet. I've also noticed quite a few people use one of the tracking focus modes. I've never used any tracking mode because the tracking modes will lock onto and track any inanimate shape or color pattern that is under the focus box when the focus button is pressed. For wildlife, this can be a problem because if the subject is momentarily obscured, the camera will have a tendency to lock onto whatever is under the focus box and start tracking it, rather than looking for a subject somewhere in the frame again. With an autofocus scan rate of 120 frames per second, the camera is quick enough to find the subject again within 1 or 2 frames, even if it has moved slightly from its last position in the frame. So that's settings done, and now let's have a look at some examples. Note that I had pre-capture set to 0.3 seconds, so the first 10 frames in the following sequences would have been captured during the pre-capture. My shutter speed was also a bit slower than what I would have liked because of the poor light. And with these small birds, 1/4000th of a second is often not enough to prevent motion blur. And the stints were captured using only 1/2500th seconds. Unfortunately, the sun has been hard to find here in Melbourne in the last 6 months. Here we have a male fairy wren taking off and flying toward the camera. As you can see, the camera has no difficulty keeping the focus on the bird. This is taken with the FE 200-600 lens with a 1.4 teleconverter attached at 840mm. And the lens is more than fast enough to track this type of subject accurately, despite what many people seem to think. The next example is a redneck stint, which are very quick, as anyone who's tried to photograph them in flight knows. I was a little late on the shutter button here. And another stint example. And one more with two sitting side by side. Unfortunately, the light was not great, so slow shutter speed meant that images are not as sharp as I would have liked. Nevertheless, it's always good practice. Here is a singing honey eater. Again, slow shutter speed meant lots of motion blur, and 30 frames a second seems to exactly match the wing beats, so not much variation in the wing positions. And a white-browed scrub wren during a moment of better light. And then finally, a handsome male fairy wren catching grubs on the ground. Another scenario where I use pre-capture is when I'm trying to capture images of small birds in flight and they are flying towards me from some distance away. Often it's not possible to keep them in the frame as they come closer. So to avoid capturing hundreds of images when they are small in the frame, I will use pre-capture. And once I've managed to successfully keep them in the frame until they are close enough for a detailed image, I will then fully depress the shutter button. Now let's take a look at some images of sandpipers taken when the camera and subject are close to the ground and the subject is partially obscured by twigs or branches. I use a second back focus button program to use spot extra small because it can be difficult to acquire focus using wide area mode if the bird is obscured. So I use the spot extra small to pick out the eye, and as soon as I have the eye in focus, I switch to the other back focus button and wide takes over, which makes it easier to then continue following the bird as it moves or if it takes flight. And that's it. A quick demonstration of the A1-2 pre-capture and autofocus settings and performance. It's not an earth-shattering improvement over the A1, but the acquisition is a little quicker and the stickiness of the subject detection is slightly better. To me, the big drawback remains the 30 frames per second, which is just not enough for really fast wildlife action, and particularly for small birds. Well, I hope you find this useful, and to finish off, a few more images taken during the same outing. So until next time.